At 5 in the morning in Scunthorpe, the glow from the blast furnaces still lit the sky. For more than a century, that glow had meant stability, wages, pride, and identity. British Steel was not just an industry. It was a promise. A promise that heavy industry still had a place in modern Britain. But in the spring of 2019, that promise was about to break. Inside the offices of British Steel, executives were staring at spreadsheets that no longer added up. Cash was draining by the hour. Suppliers were demanding payment up front. Customers were hesitating. And in the background, the political chaos of Brexit was tightening like a vice. Now you might be thinking, this is just another story of an old industrial giant slowly fading away. A predictable decline. But here is where it gets interesting. British Steel did not fade quietly. It collapsed almost overnight. And just when everyone believed it was impossible to save, when liquidation papers were already being prepared, the company was pulled back from the edge at the very last moment. This is the story of how British Steel nearly went bankrupt, why it seemed beyond saving, and how it survived when survival looked mathematically impossible. British Steel was born from fire, coal, and ambition. Steelmaking in Britain dates back hundreds of years, but the modern legacy of British Steel truly took shape during the Industrial Revolution. By the 20th century, steel was the backbone of the British economy. Railways, bridges, ships, weapons, and cities were all built from it. After decades under state ownership, the industry was privatized and reshaped multiple times. In 2016, the British Steel assets were spun out from Tata Steel Europe and rebranded as British Steel. On paper, it was a fresh start. New management, a focused portfolio, and about 5,000 workers, many concentrated in Scunthorpe, producing long steel products used in construction and infrastructure. At first, optimism returned. Orders flowed in. British Steel positioned itself as a specialist producer rather than a commodity giant. The furnaces kept running. For a town like Scunthorpe, that meant everything. Schools, shops, and families all revolved around the shift patterns of the plant. But beneath the surface, the foundations were already cracking. In its early years after the spin-off, British Steel benefited from stable European demand and relatively predictable trade conditions. Steel prices were not spectacular, but they were workable. The company invested in efficiency improvements and secured contracts for rail and construction projects. This period was not a golden age, but it was enough to convince many that British Steel had found its footing. Management believed that with careful cost control and niche specialization, the company could survive in a global market dominated by massive producers in China and elsewhere. Yet the reality of steelmaking is brutally simple. Margins are thin, energy costs are high, and any shock to demand or trade flows can turn profit into loss almost instantly. That shock arrived sooner than anyone expected. Please subscribe to our channel. We want to hit 5,000 subscribers this week. Now, let's move on with the video. The first major crack was energy. British industrial electricity prices were among the highest in Europe. Steelmaking is energy intensive, and every extra pound per megawatt hour directly eats into margins. British Steel was already operating at a disadvantage compared to continental rivals. Then came the second crack. Global steel markets were flooded with cheap supply, much of it originating from Asia. Even with trade protections, prices remained under pressure. British Steel could not simply raise prices to cover rising costs. But the decisive blow was political. Brexit created uncertainty on a scale the company had never experienced. Steel buyers delayed orders. Export routes became unclear. Currency fluctuations added risk. And most critically, British Steel lost access to certain European carbon trading allowances that had previously helped offset costs. By early 2019, the company was losing around £700,000 per day. Cash reserves evaporated. Lenders grew nervous. And the British government, wary of setting a precedent for bailouts, hesitated. At this point, British Steel was not just struggling. It was technically insolvent. In May 2019, the unthinkable happened. British Steel entered compulsory liquidation. Officially, the company was finished. The furnaces were at risk of being shut down. 5,000 jobs hung in the balance. For Scunthorpe, it felt like the end of an era. Why was it considered beyond saving? First, steel plants are not like ordinary factories. You cannot simply turn off a blast furnace and restart it later without enormous cost and damage. Shutting down meant permanent loss. Second, the scale of investment required was massive. Any buyer would need to absorb ongoing losses, modernize aging infrastructure, and navigate hostile market conditions. Third, timing was disastrous. Brexit uncertainty scared away potential investors. No one wanted to commit billions while trade rules were still unresolved. The British government stepped in only to keep the lights on temporarily. It funded operations for a few weeks, not to save the company, but to buy time. Many insiders believe this was just a slow march toward closure. But wait, there is more to this story. Behind the scenes, one potential buyer was quietly running the numbers. A buyer who saw value where others saw ruin. That buyer was Jingye Group, a privately owned Chinese steel conglomerate. Jingye specialized in turning around distressed steel assets. They understood scale. They understood long-term strategy. And crucially, they were willing to think beyond short-term profit. Negotiations were intense. Time was running out. Every day of delay increased losses and risk. In early 2020, just as liquidation seemed inevitable, a deal was reached. Jingye agreed to acquire British Steel, pledging over £1.2 billion in investment. The furnaces would stay on, jobs would be largely preserved, and Scunthorpe would live on. This was not a miracle. It was a calculated gamble. Jingye believed British Steel could survive if energy costs were managed, if product focus was sharpened, and if the company was integrated into a global supply network. They also bet that Britain would continue to need domestic steel for infrastructure and national security reasons. For the workers, it felt like being pulled back from the edge of a cliff. The rescue of British Steel was not just about saving one company. It was a moment that exposed the fragility of modern industrial economies. How did British Steel almost fail? It sat at the intersection of old industry and new uncertainty. High energy costs, global oversupply, political disruption, and thin margins that left no room for error. When those forces collided, collapse was swift. Why was it almost impossible to save? Because steelmaking demands scale, patience, and capital. Western investors wanted quick returns. Governments feared endless subsidies, and the market offered no mercy. So how was it saved at the last moment? By a buyer willing to absorb short-term pain for long-term positioning. Jingye did not see British Steel as a standalone business. They saw it as part of a global system, a strategic foothold, a long game. But the story does not end with a neat victory. Even after the rescue, challenges remained. Energy prices continued to rise, environmental regulations tightened, and geopolitical tensions raised new questions about foreign ownership of critical infrastructure. British Steel survived, but survival came at a cost. Independence was traded for security. Local control gave way to global strategy. In the end, the near collapse of British Steel serves as a warning and a lesson. A warning that industrial giants can fall faster than anyone expects. And a lesson that sometimes salvation comes not from nostalgia or national pride, but from cold calculations made thousands of miles away. The furnaces in Scunthorpe still burn. The glow still lights the sky. But now, it carries a different meaning. Not certainty, not dominance, but survival. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe. I will see you tomorrow.